Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's Going to Be Alright. My name is Niklas and
And I'm Clayton Gwen.
And today, we are going to talk about, or not really talk about, but it's questions and answer time. That's what it is. It's a Q&A session.
Yeah. And it's live. Well, it's not being broadcast live. We are sitting for the first time in a live breakout room as part of the digital study hall that NMBU offers. So students can come in and sit within a variety of different rooms. We're in the Skillshare room where we're going to be sharing our skills around all things academic writing. But there's a variety of other zones or rooms that students can go to get assistance.
We have there's a focus zone. That's where you can work structured for 45 minutes and then have a 15-minute break, and that's on repeat for 4 hours, I think. And then there's the consultation room. You can meet a writing advisor. One of our fantastic employees at the writing center will help you out in the consultation room. And sometimes there's also a librarian there, I think, that can help out with citations, referencing, information searches, that kind of stuff. Then you got the very informal hangout space where you can talk to people, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
So the way that this episode is going to be, since we're live in a room, although we're not broadcasting it, we might end up being punctuated by people who are entering, trying to figure out what's going on here. We'll try to let them know and answer their questions. So we'll apologize in advance if you hear any repetition. I'll do my best to try to edit this down to keep it nice and succinct and streamlined. But of course, since both of us have worked in classroom settings for a long time, we know how difficult it is to elicit questions from a room full of people.
Yeah.
So we took the liberty upon ourselves to actually go ahead and generate some questions from our Facebook pages that we're active on. So me through the Society for Doctoral Students at NMBU, and Niklas, since you're managing the Facebook page for the NMBU Writing Center, as well as you solicited some questions from our writing advisors.
Yes.
So we're going to begin with those, as well as we have some to keep on the the theme of questions and answers. We've also gathered some information on some different ideas about how to ask questions, why to ask questions, and different ways that you can stimulate learning development. So we've got a variety of different ideas and themes and topics to try to work through, as well as any other questions of people who may or may not pop into this room for the next hour.
So that's kind of this episode is going to be a little bit more unfocused than how they usually are. We usually have a topic that we talk about, and then we obviously follow all kinds of digressions and stuff. But this time we're just going to address a bunch of different questions. So let's see how we can kind of stitch that together, and it's going to be exciting.
See what happens. So why don't we start out with some of the questions that you have ended up gathering?
Yeah. Okay. So when talking to the writing advisors, I asked them, what is like the most common questions that you get from the students that you're consulting? What do they usually struggle with? And structure is a thing that is constantly addressed. So this means structure on the macro level and on the micro level. So everything from the entire document, all the different sections, what kind of format you should use, and all the way down to sentences, really.
So we got a question from someone who popped into the room about writing structure, and more of a point actually than a question, which was really good. That different assignments in different courses, and obviously across different departments, have different structures to them. So different expectations that need to be navigated as well. I know from my experience being a student, some of those structures are very clear. It's very easy to know what's expected, how you're supposed to structure it, the sections or chapters that are to be contained. But Other times that's not necessarily the case. You get, here's a word limit, here's a list of topics that we would expect you to write on. And that causes a lot of problems around how to structure your academic writing to fulfill the expectations of that course.
So, I mean, sometimes it's as you said, extremely clear what you're going to do. Maybe the course responsible have given you some kind of guide on what they want, a lab report to look like or something like that. But especially in the social sciences, I feel like it can sometimes be a lot more unclear. And it seems like the professor is kind of expecting you to know how to write this particular text without really informing you about what it's going to contain or the sections, how it's going to be built up. So I think that the best thing you can do is, first of all, do a Google search. If they want you to write a short assignment, and whatever they call it, try to Google that and see if you can find, some guidelines. Because most universities have more or less the same, they follow the same formula, more or less. But I also want to talk about the hourglass structure.
I just want to quickly add something there about understanding the type of writing that you're supposed to do. So obviously using the internet to look for the different structures, the different types of writing follow is a good idea, but knowing what type of structure is expected based on the type of writing, it's useful to know, are you just doing a literature review?
Yeah.
We've talked about this in other episodes before in more detail, but is it a lab report that you're producing? Is it a critique? Are you doing a comparison and contrast? Are you trying to sort of summarize the main ideas in the course? Are you expected to critically dissect a reading that you have and analyze it? Is it an analytical report that you're producing? So some of that information is hopefully available to you in the instructions that you get for the assignment. But if they're not, if you feel like you need more guidance, it's always a good idea to just ask the professor. Ask them in the class or send an email to clarify what it is as far as a structure that they're really expecting to see.
You can even write them a message on Teams if you want to.
If it's a digital classroom, yeah.
I also think the hourglass structure is a good starting point because it informs you about how an academic text should be constructed, no matter how long it is, how extensive it is, what kind of format. It doesn't really matter. You need to start out general with an introduction that ends up with something more specific. It could be the problem formulation, a set of research questions, or maybe an hypothesis that you are going to investigate. And then you have the main, like the body part of the text. That's where you do the analysis or compare different things or give a presentation of your results, whatever. And then you have the conclusion, which has an opposite. It's built in an opposite manner than the introduction. It starts out super specific with restating hypothesis or problem formulation, and then you go into giving a presentation of your central findings, and then a conclusion at the end, which you should try to connect to, I would say, the discipline at large. In a sense, try to show why you have been investigating is important. So that's the hourglass structure. Maybe you don't do a video recording, but we could include a link because we have some. We have a bunch of pictures of it, and I think we also have something on our YouTube channel about it, don't we?
We've got some stuff on IMRAD specifically, which is the kind of the general scientific approach using this. As well, it's integrated with ideas of general to specific. Right now, we're working on a series of new resources for Canvas, basically, that can be integrated into classrooms, which we're hoping we'll be able to make some video resources of as well. I think you brought up a really good point that I also just wanted to touch on that I think is kind of a struggle that people face. We don't need to cover it now because we have it as a separate section as well too, but when you're talking about conclusions, what is your contribution, and how do you sort of understand what it is that you've actually done and what you're providing the community with at large. But let's hold off on that one because we have a section to talk about the difference between discussions and results. So, yeah, more on the general struggles with writing structure. Aside from knowing what expectations are for the type of writing that you're supposed to do, generally, I also end up finding that people kind of just struggle with creating logical transitions. Being able to create a paragraph that moves the reader from sentence to sentence in a very effective way, as well as moves from paragraph to paragraph with smooth and meaningful transitions or bridges. So we've got other resources on this, typically under, we call it Cohesion and the SEEC structure. But a quick breakdown of that is you want to think about every paragraph as kind of being a self-contained idea, and each paragraph should focus on that one idea. It's directed by the first sentence, the topic sentence that you write, and it should be the most general thing that you can say about the idea that that paragraph is going to focus on. Every preceding sentence that comes after should be connected to that main idea and is designed to expand the reader's understanding of the idea with more complex evidence and examples before you conclude about that idea in the concluding sentence at the end of the paragraph, while trying to transition towards the next topic of what the next paragraph is going to be about.
And just to clarify, like the end of a paragraph, it doesn't have to be a conclusion in the sense that, like, this is what I conclude with. It could also be a standpoint. This is the standpoint that I take on the matter in relation to the information that I've been presenting earlier in the paragraph. So, with the examples, with all the different details, with the facts that you've gotten from the literature that you have decided to base your research on, you can take a standpoint. And that can lead you into the next paragraph where you can kind of expand on the same idea, or you can add on new information, but you need to build the complexity gradually. This is something that we've been talking about many, many times, that complexity needs to be built gradually. You can't start out with hyper complex things and lots of different technical terms because people might not understand what they mean. So you need to build it, you need to start with the... Mm-hmm. We've been using the house analogy many times. You need to start with the foundations.
Exactly, and then build the necessary structure and final details around a good, strong foundation. And yeah, a concluding sentence in a paragraph, you're absolutely right. It doesn't need to say anything definitive. You can also think about its role as being a transition between this specific idea is now concluded, and what I'm going to present you with next in the new paragraph is something new. Now, it doesn't need to be entirely new. It is very often just a extension of that initial idea. Okay, now in this next paragraph, let's get a bit more complex with it. Let's bring in a new factor. And we're going to use this paragraph to develop that idea before we kind of conclude to transition towards a newer, more complex idea.
Think about it like this. You've seen one of the David Attenborough, all the different like nature programs. Mm-hmm. There you see transitions all the time. Like, yes. Let's say you see, here we have the ant's nest or hive. What do you call it? Ant?
The colony or the ant hill.
Yeah, the ant hill, the ant colony. So, and then... he talks about the ants and what they do outside of the colony, and then you see an opening and you see one of the ants go in, and suddenly then there's a transition. Then you see what happens inside of the colony, the different tasks that the different ants have, and it's very similar. One paragraph introduces you to the general, so you see the colony, you see the place, you see the tree where the colony is probably next to a tree. So you see all that, and then you get into the more detailed stuff.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, you're going to see how they use what does he call it? The leaf bladlus in Norwegian. It's like small green insects that they use as cows. Have you seen that?
No, caterpillars?
No, not caterpillars. They're really small. It's
or aphids, maybe?
it's called bladlus in Norwegian. It's like very small green insects that lives on leaves.
I think potentially aphids. I could be wrong.
And some ants, they have them as I wouldn't say pets, but it's kind of like livestock, or they use them as cows. They milk them.
That's a digression instead of a transition. I want to say that you make a great point of David Attenborough nature documentaries, because think about the narrative that is being constructed. So very often the episode isn't just on ants and the life of ants. There's a connection as a new species in a new region is presented as well. So you can think about how David Attenborough makes these transitions from, okay, we're done talking about ants, but we're still talking about this same idea. Maybe it is social cooperation. Then you get a new scene and it's an eagle flying, and, then the transition is unlike ants, or unlike some species that are incredibly social, the social traits of more solitary animals, such as, this Mexican eagle. Okay, so we're still talking about some kind of social interaction that's happening, but now we're talking about something quite different. It's the same idea, but we've transitioned to something new. So there's that, the red thread, as Norwegians love to say, but you're always introducing new examples to kind of prove the point. So that is like probably the best example that we've ever had on this podcast. Go, David Attenborough, master of transitions.
Master of transitions. Yeah, I mean, that's a cool title to have, though. But one thing is, let's say that you have a general idea. Let's say how animals, cooperate, for example. But then you could also have different traits in animals, how different species cooperate. That also happens in these nature shows all the time, like how one animal eats ants and then you transition into their lives, or how they cooperate in some kind of strange fashion through because of evolution. I mean, but I think if you want to know anything about transitions, go look at David Attenborough. He is the master of transitions.
And to see how, if we summarize this this question up as well on questions of structure, we typically at the Writing Center deal with it around the idea of cohesion. So we have lots of resources linked to, sentence level cohesion, character actor using the active voice, moving from general to specific, paragraph cohesion, which is a lot of what we've been focusing on here, and then structural cohesion, which we've talked about in other podcast episodes. Introductions contain the most general information. The methods contain only information about your methods. Your results contain only information about the main findings that will be talked about in the discussion section before you lead to your conclusion. We've got a lot of great resources on all of that stuff. So talk about master of transitions. How about we, since we're on the IMRAD structure, this is something that has kind of come up a lot as well too, is questions about separating your results from your discussion, and how do you kind of demonstrate your contribution in science. So maybe let's start with the first part of that. What's the difference between a results section and a discussion section? What are your thoughts?
The easiest answer to that is results is facts. It's a presentation of facts that you have produced through some kind of experiment or interviews or whatever you've done. The discussion, that's interpretation.
Yes.
So that's the difference. Presentation of facts that you have produced, which is an interesting thing in itself, because then you need to be aware that the way you produce them might make them more or less valid, depending on your methods, for example, depending on how well your research is constructed. But the discussion is definitely interpretation.
Yeah, and this is hard to separate, because often when we're generating our results, we're already interpreting them. It's only when we get to the writing stage that we have to consider, how do we separate them? And this is going to vary from discipline to discipline and what is expected across different disciplines of writing and different disciplines of science. Much more common in the natural sciences to try to separate your results, present the relevant facts that will be discussed with a presentation of the methods, the analytical methods that were used to produce them, where the results is really kind of your effort to direct your reader's attention to the important facts that will be discussed, which is why when you read results sections, they're usually, tables, figures, graphs, pictures, and it's there. All of that text is really just designed to say, "Hey, reader, look at this number, look at this number, look at this part of the picture or the visual that's being presented," because that's the information that we're going to interpret and discuss in our discussion section. So it's the results is usually what is used to present the interesting findings, the interesting facts that are relevant to discuss, as well as an opportunity, as you said, to point out potential limitations to the methods that generated those results in the first place. What the results or what the methods can and maybe cannot say about and how valid the results or the facts that you have generated actually are. And then the discussion is, okay, now I've pointed out what I actually want to talk about. Now let me interpret it for the reader. What's my understanding of it in relation to my research questions?
I mean, we did a PhD webinar on discussion section as well. And one thing is interpretation. So it depends on the discipline. I mean, in the social sciences, you're usually interpreting results or findings or information from other, from literature, using different theoretical concepts or some kind of experience that you had in the real world that you tried to interpret using a concept. It's easy for me to talk about, pedagogy because I've been working with that previously. So that would be, let's say that you go into a classroom, you get the students to work on a task, and then you try to use different theoretical concepts to understand how they are interacting with that task. If it's a good way to learn or if it's not a good way to learn, and how different people kind of solve the problem. So I think it's important you said something about that there's a difference between, like, the different disciplines have different requirements. And in the natural sciences, you will usually use the IMRAD structure. So that's, in scientific writing, it's kind of the golden standard, I would say. You have introduction, methods, results, and discussion. That's what IMRAD stands for. But in the social sciences, it might look a little bit different. You could follow the IMRAD structure, but you will usually need to adjust it a little bit. And sometimes you will see a combination of results and discussion. That's not unusual. That and then you could say, and sometimes there will not be a methods section, for example. That could also happen in the social sciences because it's a literature review. So we have an introduction, literature review, and then discussion section, which is you discussing things that you have found in different sources using a theoretical framework that you have that you think is beneficial.
You may also have sections or chapters called theoretical framework or conceptual framework, which serve the same purpose as a method section. You introduce the core concepts or the core theories that are going to be used and applied and give the reader relevant information so they can understand what these theories and concepts are. So it's also a literature review. This is one thing that, since we're on the topic, it might be worth answering that question. What is a literature review? Well, a literature review is any time that you are reading other people's work and citing it. It's as simple as that. It gets more complex if you are writing a type of research article or a type of research essay that is a literature review. You might need to find structures that allow you to review the literature in certain ways. There would then be a separation of, your introduction will contain a literature review. You establish the necessary background information for your reader to understand using sources and citations. Your methods, your literature review section, your conceptual or theoretical framework section is also a literature review where you're drawing on other sources to demonstrate what is known and what current thoughts are and express your understanding of what you are using and why you were using it. The results is typically not a literature review because it's what you have already found, the facts that you have arrived at or generated from your research, but your discussion is also a type of literature review. It's a literature review where you associate your results to the results and understandings of other people within the discipline. So that's why you will see citations in academic papers in the introduction, sometimes in the methods, and then throughout the discussion, and potentially again in the conclusion, but maybe less so. So I think that is something to be aware of. A literature review can be a type of research that you do. A literature review is also just any time that you're relying on someone else's information as a citation in your text to appropriately support what you're trying to do with that section.
So just to provide a couple of examples, one would be the historian, right? Let's say that you want to analyze a text that is, let's say 1,000 years old. It's a literature review. There's no other way to interact with that text. You have to try to interpret what's in it using some kind of theoretical framework that you find to be beneficial. But writing about these different concepts is also a literature review. Another example would be back to pedagogy. Let's say that you want to interact with students in the classroom and see how, if some kind of approach to learning works or not. You are interacting with the real world in a very different manner than reading a text that is 1,000 years old. But you want to be able to interpret what happens. You probably need to read a lot. You need to read other people's research. You need to be well versed in the different concepts that is prominent within pedagogy in order to analyze the situation and then come up with something that might be a more beneficial strategy for learning. So that's different approaches to a literature review. For the last example, it's a part of the text. It's one out of multiple sections. But in the case of the historian, that's the entire text, more or less.
It's the style of text, and that also occurs if you do a meta-analysis, which is the most rigorous type of literature review that you can do. If you do a systematic literature review, so now we're talking about research designs which produce research writing. But for most of the time, if you're doing empirical research, if you're doing secondary research is obviously also reliant on literature review. You're going to be reviewing other people's literature because that's what is going to help to inform your problem formulation, to justify your research questions, to inform the methods that you'll use, to inform how your results relate to other people's research in your discussion. Which then kind of leads us to that question of how do you know what your contribution is? I'm hoping we've maybe answered the difference between results and discussion well enough, even though it's maybe a bit more of a gray area for social sciences, probably because your results and interpretation tend to happen together in the methods that you use.
At the same time, yeah.
But that can also really complicate, well, then what are my actual findings? What's my contribution?
The result is your interpretation of something, in a sense.
So, Niklas, I want to say, because you spend more time with the writing advisors than I do, you generated a really good response, but I can't remember who it came from.
It came from Elena, which is the coordinator of the digital study hall.
There we go. So when you sent that over, man, I thought that she just gave one of the best ways to both differentiate between the results and discussion, but also to help you really understand your own claims and how you support those claims in relation to other people's literature. So I've already pulled it up. Do you want me to do it, or do you want to speak on her behalf? she said the way she works with students is she'll sit down and say, first thing to do is go back to your research questions. And what are the general claims that you can make that kind of address each of those research questions? And, this is sometimes a struggle because your research might have produced something a little bit different than what you were trying to produce, as the nature of research. So what new questions kind of formulated through your research process that can be answered by the results that you have gathered? What you also want to try to do is synthesize an overarching argument that connects and cuts across all of your various research questions. So what's the relationship between those questions? Because that helps to formulate an argument for the larger context, which is really what your discussion should be about. Where slowly, in the IMRAD hourglass structure, when you hit the discussion, you're really starting to broaden back out and apply your findings to the larger context or the larger field. So this means you're discussing your results against literature that had been introduced previously in your introduction, in a literature review chapter, a background chapter, a theoretical or conceptual framework chapter, as well as bringing in new literature that might help to demonstrate how you're filling a knowledge gap, how you are solving a problem, how your research supports or comes into conflict with other people's findings, and what that support or conflict might end up meaning. So you kind of can use your discussion as a bit of like a compare and contrast of your understanding of what you've found with how you think it relates to what other people have found in your field. This is where she says you've got to get meta. What does all of this then actually mean for your discipline? What were the core concepts, theories, or methods that you've used? What have you learned from using those within the research that you've conducted? And then what are your recommendations? Which really leads us more towards looking forward and concluding the writing that you were doing. So based off of my interpretation of the findings that I've produced, and when I compare my interpretation of my findings to other literature in the field, what do I think should be done? This could be, we need more research. We need to ask these types of questions. These questions have not been really understood yet. Or maybe you've solved the problem that you started out with, you've pieced together the puzzle that you were working on, or you've filled a knowledge gap. So what are your recommendations there? What should be applied? Who should do something? And we've talked about these concepts and approaches a lot through the podcast because it's sort of my modus operandi when I work with people is the problem, puzzle, gap formulation of research as a way of demonstrating your contribution.
Yeah, and just to make a concrete example, I mean, if you're into soil science, for example, and you're investigating, let's say a bacteria that lives in the soil, then at some point in the discussion when you try to kind of branch out, like how does that bacteria affect other life in the soil? Or why is it relevant to humans? How is it relevant to humans? Can it be used?
How is it maybe affected by human activities like use of herbicides or fungicides in the soil? And what impact does that have on people who rely on the soil or study the soil or other things that are reliant on these organisms?
And for example, in social sciences, I know a lot of people over at IMRAD is in development studies. Then it would be, advice to policymakers, how to reformulate the political system or change certain procedures. I mean, that could be a way of branching out in the discussion section, giving some recommendations on not only future research and what you could possibly do, finished with my PhD or with my master's thesis, and now I want to continue as a researcher, so I could focus on this. For example, that's a way to kind of try to get a job in the future. It's a very practical approach.
And knowing the contribution you make is also much easier when you know the audience that you are writing for. So we've talked about this quite extensively in some of the last PhD webinars, but it's relevant to all research levels and all writers. So you can find that interrelation between your audience and how you're supposed to write and what your contribution ends up being on our NMBU Writing Center YouTube channel. We've got some playlists there. There's one called PhD Webinars, where we go into much more detail about this. But that's also something important to think about. Who are you writing for? And who is going to benefit from the research that you've done? So if you're already starting your writing from that standpoint, the contribution you make is much easier to see and more meaningful to target because you know who is going to benefit from it. We have a simpler video as well too on the YouTube channel called Clarifying Your Research Purpose, the 4 big questions or something like that. It's much simpler and it kind of addresses how you can figure this stuff out and establish a research purpose. So if you have that clear understanding of what you're researching, why you're researching it, how you're researching it, so the methods that you're using, and who is going to benefit from this research, who your audience is, knowing that research purpose makes it even easier to identify what your actual contribution is. So there are 4 really simple questions to ask. And if you can answer those, it becomes easier to figure out, okay, so what did I do? What did I find? What do I think it means? And then how is all of it relevant to answering those 4 what, why, how, and who questions?
Yeah, that's true.
Have we more or less crushed that?
I think it's we pulverized it.
Pulverized at this point.
So that means
before we get to the boring stuff, because we've got common questions about referencing and citing, there was something that came up from one of the last PhD webinars, which was more for people who are maybe listening who are wanting to get into research. Maybe you want to get into a master's program and you're planning on writing your master's thesis, or maybe you want to do a PhD, or maybe you want to get into a research institute later on and you'll be writing for funding for research. So there was a PhD who asked us last month, for some information on writing a research statement. This is something that we haven't really covered before. So if you don't mind, I've already got the information up that I had sent over to her. She had even asked, could you make an episode or a resource on this? So maybe now is a great time to address that. So I would highly, highly recommend, and I will try to remember to put this in the show notes, the Purdue Online Writing Lab, or Purdue OWL, is one of the greatest resources that I am always finding myself going back to answer a lot of these questions. And they have a writing a research statement page. So I'll kind of summarize it very quickly and then put the link in to the show description for you to go look up on your own. So a research statement is a short document providing a history of past research experience, the state of your current research, and the future area that you want to work in. So this is really helpful if you want to be a potential candidate for a lot of post-undergraduate study, so graduate programs, postdoctoral fellowships, faculty positions, or with research institutes. Generally, they're a single or a two-sided, single-spaced document, so 1 to 2 pages, that should end up including a bit of information about your past research. What questions did you initially set out to answer in previous research projects? What did you find? How did it contribute to your field? So, like we've already talked about. And then how did your past research propel you forward to come to your present research? What are the questions you're actively trying to solve? How far have you gotten? How are you connecting your research to wider academic conversations? So peer-reviewed literature, producing articles out of your research. So for example, if you want to convert your master's thesis into a book chapter or into an article, or if you're a PhD, how do you and produce a monograph? How do you do some of this stuff? As well as then what's the future trajectory that you want your research to take? What questions do you also want to solve? Why is it relevant to find answers to these questions? How do you expect to do it? And what are their broader implications? So I'm not going to provide a full description of this, but you can find it if you just end up searching Purdue OWL or OWL, writing a research statement. Anyway, she found that page to be incredibly practical and useful for her, and answered all the questions she had while she was trying to write a research statement.
Great. I mean, we come back to that resource all the time. They do a really good job.
Should we take a pause here and say hi to the newcomer to the room?
Another student host is visiting the podcast room today.
So we got a question from someone who popped into the room here, basically about how to create stories out of your research, how to create a sense of narrative and create something that's a bit more comprehensive for the reader to be able to navigate through. So, Nicholas, you said you had a couple of ideas on that one.
Well, first of all, we've been talking about this many times. Both me and Clayton, we're very interested in kind of the narratological aspect of academic writing. And I think a good starting point is, who's your main characters? Choose a cast. And it shouldn't be too many. It shouldn't be Game of Thrones, because you don't have that many seasons. You only have one paper. So, try to choose less characters. That's a good idea. So you need to figure out, because it's not always easy to kind of extract a set of results that is, first of all, it's not always easy to extract the most prominent results and to write about them. Sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's, the results are so, what can you say? This is easier for me to explain in Norwegian, but sometimes it's very easy to extract the results that are the most prominent, but sometimes you kind of have to work for it a little bit more. And then it's all about choosing the cast and seeing how different results interact with each other to form an interesting narrative, something that is engaging to read.
One of the things that you could do to create a narrative out of your writing is obviously not just know who the characters are, but you need to know what the conflict of the story is going to be. We work around this idea of narrative writing in scientific communication quite a bit, me especially at the PhD level. So that's going to be one of the aspects that I'm talking about at the end of this month, the 31st. We'll be talking about demonstrating doctorateness and ways that the narrative is kind of what ties together your research articles as a PhD. So what your CUPPA is kind of responsible for doing, and why thinking at a narrative perspective is very useful to make these sorts of connections. So there will be a video that comes out, a condensed version of the lecture, early next month that you'll be able to go and check out. So I won't dive into all of that, but the main idea is, have a character or a couple of key characters, and then you need to know what is the actual conflict of the story. So again, for those of you who are listening, I've kind of already touched on this, but it's about creating a research purpose. What is the problem that needs to be solved? What is the puzzle that needs to be pieced together? What is the gap that needs to be filled? And if you can figure out a lot of that stuff out, along with those 4 big questions, which are, what is the research topic? Why is this research topic important? That's where the problem, puzzle, or gap comes in. How are you going to do it? So what are your methods? And why are you choosing those methods? Why are they relevant? And what kind of characters will those methods end up producing or finding, and then who cares about it? So knowing your audience as well too. So to go back to the Game of Thrones example, it's easier to get people who are already into fantasy into a series like that than it is to get someone who is, diehard science fiction into it. So kind of knowing some of the conventions, the language, and some of the tropes, if you will, for creating and crafting that narrative. And one thing that's actually really good to help create a sense of flow through the narrative as well is knowing the style. So what type of story are you telling? Research can be done through, as we've already talked about, a literature review. It could be a case study. It could be a comparative case study. It could be a medical case study. It could be an experiment. It could be multiple experiments. It could be based through interviews. And so you're already planning on developing kind of a narrative from the narratives that people are providing you with. That's becoming much more common in the social sciences. And one other thing I would say is think about personifying what you're writing about. People love to read about people, but we also love to see and hear stories about things that have been personified, which is why you go and look at Pixar, and why is Toy Story, so endearing? They're not real. We know that they're not people. They're toys. Or, A Bug's Life, or that's probably such an old example for people now. Lady and the Tramp. We love stories about things that resemble humans. So when you write, take the time to actually personify these inanimate objects that you might be researching, these concepts or non-human entities, and give them human-like characteristics. Give them the ability to do actions that create some kind of an outcome. And not only does that help to make your writing a bit shorter because you're using the active voice, but you basically have to just kind of rely on the old apostrophe S trick. So I'll give you an example. In my research, I'm looking at ecological reclamation. So instead of saying that people who are engaged in the process of ecological reclamation should be doing all these sorts of things, if you want it to be more of a narrative, say ecological restoration or reclamation's role is. So now we've personified this inanimate object, this concept, and I've given it a human characteristic. It can have a role. It can produce. It can generate. So the type of language that you use at a sentence level is also a great way to help build these stories. And then one last thing, because I know I've been rambling for a bit, but digital storytelling is becoming a really prominent way of kind of crafting these stories about research and putting them into a slightly different context. John McNeish from the Noragric department has been doing a lot of this. So if you're not familiar with him, I believe there's still a digital story webpage up. There's also a lot of information online about what digital stories are and how to craft them. They're very much designed around a narrative or a storytelling.
Elena knows quite a bit about this because she's involved in that project. So you could definitely talk with her about, narrative structure. But I'm also going to tell a little story here because Clayton, you remember the PhD webinar about the discussion section?
Mm-hmm.
It started out with a little story that I made about the IMRAD structure. So I thought it could be fitting to tell that story here. Let me just find it real quick. Okay, so it doesn't really matter if we're talking about a text. It could be a published article on particle physics, or it could be a classic fairy tale like, something about Espen Askeladden. It doesn't really matter. They both consist of characters that drives the story or the narrative forward with their actions and by interacting with each other. So we need to remember that all writing has a beginning, that would be the introduction, a middle part, that's where the action happens, and an ending, that would be the conclusion. So we could think about an article based on the IMRAD structure as a journey, for example. It begins with a plan that tells you where you're going and what you're expecting to encounter on the way and at the final destination. And that would be in the introduction. And so that would not only be the introduction, but that would include the problem formulation, research questions, or the hypothesis. And then you will need to choose modes of transportation in order to embark on the journey and to reach the final destination. Certain places can be reached by multiple types of transportation, while others only by boat, by foot, and so forth. Your choice will in turn affect what you're able to see and experience underway and how fast you will get to the final destination. This can be seen as your chosen method or methods and theories. Your results will in turn be a product of your chosen methods. Traveling by foot will give you a highly detailed experience of the landscape. We can picture a forest, for example, where we can see the individual trees, we can see the leaves, we can see insects, birds, and so forth. But you can only see your immediate surroundings. But traveling by plane would, on the other hand, give you a totally different perspective of the landscape. It would grant you the possibility to see how it is shaped and which main components it consists of, but details would no longer be visible. This would in turn result in a different experience and a different set of information. Once you reach the final destination, That's when it's time to sit down and reflect over the journey and your experiences, and that would be you discussing your results, the most prominent results. Subsequently, the final conclusion is derived from a marriage between results and discussion, and that would be your main findings. So that was my little story about the IMRAD structure and how to turn that into a compelling narrative. Yeah, and I think just active sentences in general, they have a tendency to personalize concepts or objects in a completely different manner than using a lot of nominalizations and prepositions and that kind of stuff. So just like you learned in LNG 250 and in MTH 300, active voice. And when constructing a paragraph, start out with a topic sentence, introduce the topic, provide examples and facts, and then you end up with some kind of conclusion. That will automatically move, it will build the complexity gradually throughout the paragraph. And that is one of the main components of good storytelling, that you need to kind of introduce the reader to the scene, and then you can introduce new characters and the action and all that stuff. But they need to know the fundamentals first.
I would also say that just a quick internet search of narratives in science writing will produce a number of quality resources for you. In fact, there's been, in the last few years, some more noticeable peer-reviewed articles on the subject. One that I'm going to mention right now by Kevin Padian from the Integrative and Comparative Biology Journal, published in 2018. It's titled Narrative and Anti-Narrative in Science, How Scientists Tell Stories and Don't. This one I've actually read and would really recommend to look at because it kind of breaks down that all science writing is storytelling. It's just how much do you want to acknowledge that, and then how can you leverage that understanding to make a better, more compelling story. A couple others that I haven't read that have popped up from JSTOR search. This one comes from Lee and Mertz, I'm not sure how you pronounce that name, published in the Journal of College Science Teaching 2015, titled Writing Stories in the Sciences. Looks like it's a 10-page article available for review, as well as one by Jones and Crow, published in 2017. And where is this one coming from? It looks like Humanities and Social Sciences Communication. How can we use the science of stories to produce persuasive scientific stories? I will link those in the show description for anyone who is listening. Hopefully, the person who asked that question has been jotting these down so you can look into them right away. We've also had one more person come into the room in the process of us answering the question about narratives in science writing. So maybe we'll pause for a second and see if they have any questions.
Real quick, we kind of set out with the ambition to talk about our experience with oral exams and stuff like that. Is that something that anybody is interested in hearing about? Like some tips and tricks for oral examinations, thesis defense, that kind of stuff?
A resounding yes from our audience.
Let's do that. Because I've been an examinator or an examiner.
I like examinator, though. It sounds more like a Terminator.
Yeah, it does.
It sounds so much more authoritative.
That's the way you would say it in Norwegian, so I probably just do like a direct translation. That happens, An examiner. Examinator. It sounds cooler. I'm just going to continue with that one. Like an executioner. No. In my previous job, I was working at Østfold University College, teaching pedagogy and pedagogical theory, and I was also the supervisor of a bunch of different students writing their thesis. That meant that I was also an oral examinator. And I think a lot of students want to know a little bit about, how is that situation from the examinator's perspective, and what is the, I wouldn't say what's the point, because everybody knows what the point is, but what is the approach? What is the examiner trying to do? And I can only speak for myself and some of the people that I was working with, but we had more or less the same strategy. So you start out with getting the student to give a presentation of their project, of their thesis, or something like that. And it depends, but somewhere between 5 to 15 minutes or 5 to 20 minutes, depending on the program and the discipline and so on. But it's usually around that duration. And then it's time for a couple of questions. So you already read the thesis in advance, and you probably have written down some notes and stuff that you are curious about. Maybe there's some aspects that you find to be problematic or difficult to understand, or maybe a misunderstanding, something like that. So you will usually start out with asking some questions about, you want them to clarify certain aspects of their research. That's the way it starts out. If the student performs well and can answer these questions in a pretty good manner, then the way I would do it is that you would kind of try to relate their research and what they are doing to other things that is prominent within the discipline. So that could be other theoretical concepts that is important in the discipline but has not been used in this particular thesis. And that's all about trying to get the student to demonstrate that they have a bird's eye perspective of the discipline and all the different important theoretical approaches or methods or research that has already been done. So you really want to get them to relate their research to other people's research and kind of showcase that they know quite a bit. They're knowledgeable. They know stuff outside of their own project, and they know how to relate their project to other important findings within that discipline. Then, when that stage is over, I would usually try to, you will kind of, as a student, you will feel that an oral examination will usually go in different stages. You start out with presenting, then you get some questions about the project, and then they try to, get you to relate your research to the field at large, and then the complexity will go up a little bit. You will get more difficult questions, more specific questions. And that is usually through the end of the oral exam. And you will only experience that if you perform well. Because if you can't handle some of the more basic questions about your own research, you will never get to this stage of the oral exam. Then they will focus on, trying to get you to explain your research in the best way possible and just help you kind of get it out, basically help you defend your own project. But if you perform well and you've already done that, then the complexity will gradually go up, and it will end with, I would usually end it, in a humorous manner, where I would ask questions so ridiculously difficult that, I've already decided that they would get an A. But I would just kind of, from my own curiosity, see if they were able to answer something that was so outlandishly difficult. That would be cool if they did that. But it didn't matter if they got the question wrong. They would still get an A. And my ambition here was to kind of create a scenario where we had an interesting conversation, where they could contribute with their own creativity, try to combine concepts or different research and come up with new interesting ideas. And if an oral exam turned into a fascinating conversation, that would usually mean a really good result for the student. But I also felt like the student were able to give a lot more if they were comfortable, if they were in a setting where we kind of tried to solve a problem together.
And then I would say there's a bit of a difference between, a course final exam, an oral exam, and your thesis defense. When it comes to the course exam, I think a lot of people focus on wanting to just know the facts. And that's important that you study for that, because you'll probably be asked very factually based questions where they're looking to see that, you've memorized the core concepts, the core ideas, the core equations of the course. But it's also important to understand how those facts apply. And a really useful technique is, if you don't know the precise fact, if you can still give some semblance of an answer that isn't answering, well, the exact fact is X, but saying, well, I don't recall the exact fact. I'm going to guess, I think it's about this, But what's maybe more important is to answer why that fact is actually relevant to know. What is the application of it in the field? So if you don't have an exact response, you can give a response that demonstrates your understanding of why that fact, even if you don't recall it, has some importance within the field. What's its application? What's the consequence of applying it? When should it be applied? Why should it be applied? What's its interaction with something else? That is a great way to be able to get through an oral exam and still achieve a high grade, even an A, by not having the exact response, but being able to speak thoroughly enough around it that that small, minuscule fact is kind of obscured by your demonstration of knowing why that fact is important. Now, when it comes to your thesis defense, I would say some of the best things to do are don't try to hide your weaknesses. Address them right away. Many students are scared to do this. Weakness in the theory that they used, weakness in the method, weakness in their sample size, weakness in calibration of the instruments being done incorrectly, whatever it may be. If you haven't addressed that stuff in your master's thesis, your defense presentation is a perfect time to do it. It demonstrates you've thought about the problems that you have encountered, why those problems were there, what those problems mean for the validity of your results, and what you would have done differently, and why you think you can still make a statement at the end of your research. And I've explained it to students before that you can think about the question period that comes after the presentation as the examiner's having a series of bullets that they're stacking up on the table. Throughout the presentation, they've got these questions because they've read your thesis. So they've already stacked up a bunch of those bullets that they're going to fire at you when your presentation is done. If you can try your best to answer a lot of those questions by moving beyond what had been written in your thesis and talking about broader implications or the weaknesses of your research or some things that you just didn't have room or time for to write about, you're actually stealing those bullets off of the desk. You're taking away opportunities for them to fire things at you in the question period. And if you take that sort of approach and really use the defense presentation as an opportunity to say more than what your thesis did, instead of doing what many people do, which is, here's a section for my introduction, let me read it word for word. Here are my methods, which you've already read about. Here are my results, which you've already read about. Here are the main discussion points, which you've already read about. And here are my thoughts in the conclusion, which you've already read about. You haven't done anything to answer the questions that have generated while they've been reading your thesis.
Plus, you've given the examinators, a lot of time. You will give them a lot of time to fire all these bullets, to grill you, to ask you difficult questions. So if you take ownership over the conversation, that's definitely the best. So I'm not saying that you're supposed to override the examiner, but try to take ownership and try to talk about your own project. And as Clayton said, address the limitations. You could talk about some how it can be applied in different ways that you have been talking about in the thesis, or you could give some recommendations, for example. Yeah. There's so many things that you could do.
You give them something new to think about, so all of a sudden they're on their toes and they have to think about, well, now I need to come up with new questions because they've given me a lot of new information. So their questions might not be as direct, they might not be as hard either, because they kind of answered this thing for me, but maybe I'm thinking a bit more about this now. And it ends up just kind of making the defense more conversational than sitting behind a firing line who's going to say, well, I've got 10 questions that I'm going to ask, and I expect very clear and precise answers from you. It's a great technique to end up using, but it does require more work. So don't expect that once your thesis is written, your work is done. No, I mean, the bulk of your work is done, but you have all of this reflective work that needs to go on. And if you do this, I've had students come back to me afterwards and say, because of your advice, because of how I prepared, how I practiced, and how I delivered all of this stuff in the presentation, the defense evaluation committee actually told me that it bumped my grade up. I was going to get a C, I got an A. So it does work.
A couple of things that is important to address here. One is that you can never bump down. You can only go up. So it doesn't matter if you totally bomb.
I don't know if it's changed. I have heard that there was consideration, at least in the department that I'm in, that if your defense is really weak, it could lower.
It could lower the grade?
Yeah.
Okay.
I haven't followed up on that, though. So I'd just be aware. I don't want to spread any misinformation.
Okay. That was at least the way it used to be. You could never go down. You could only go up. But, okay, let's take but it's definitely something that you should check. It's a lot better to just practice, though. Practice on, talk with friends, give a lot of different presentations, talk to yourself. When you're, in the car, going for a walk, something like that, just practice your own presentation. Practice trying to, connect your research to other things within the same topic or the same field. What is also important to address is that, let's say that you have 30 minutes. It's 30 or 45 minutes that it's been, set. That's going to be the time, that's the duration of the oral exam. If it's done before that, if it's done in 15 or 20 minutes, or if it goes on for an hour, doesn't really mean anything. You can get an A after 50 minutes and you can get an A after 1.5 hours. So when you go out after the oral exam is over, don't overthink it. I was only in for 30 minutes. They said they had enough. Like, what does that mean? Doesn't necessarily, you don't know what it means. I've had students that, they took ownership over the conversation and we were done in 25 minutes. We got, all the information we need. There was no need to dive any, it was unnecessary. And sometimes that could mean that you get a C. We don't think this student can perform any better. Or you could get an A, or you could get an E. It doesn't really mean anything. So don't overthink that. If you're in for 20 minutes or 1 hour, doesn't really matter.
So speaking of time, I guess this room was set to be 1 hour. So here we are a little bit over time, but that's okay, because in the podcast world, I'll edit it all down and no one will know the difference. Then I guess we got to do our tagline out. We don't have a good segue into it this time.
No, so we can basically say that if you take all the stuff that we have said into consideration and you start listening to our podcast, look at all the different videos on our YouTube channel and look at SWR 100, our digital resource portal on Canvas, it's going to be all right.
I was actually just going to say, at this live podcast in a breakout room with Q&A session with everyone actually worked out all right.
That was maybe a smoother one.